Hi, I'm Lee Abrams, the managing director of the Z-Rock format, and I'd like to spend a couple of minutes with you to run through a little bit of history and then talk about how Z-Rock fits into the whole mix here in 1988. Now, back in 1968, there's a whole huge thing happening in that whole new generation of bands were selling millions of records, selling out concerts, groups like Jethro Tull and Pink Floyd and Led Zeppelin. And there was really no place to hear them except on progressive radio, which was pretty out there. These were the kind of stations that if it was raining, you'd hear hours and hours of rain songs, or if the nighttime disc jockey was into bluegrass, well, that's what you heard. Now, you also could hear some of this music on Top 40, but in order to hear the big hit by the Rolling Stones or the Moody Blues, you'd have to put up with half hour or more of Herb Alpert and Gary Puckett and the Union Gap and artists like that. So basically, in 1968, this whole thing was happening, but there was no one format that really appealed to it in its purest form. So me and a bunch of other people came up with a concept called AOR, which it wasn't known as back then, but basically the idea was to take these bands like the Rolling Stones, Moody Blues, Santana, Jimi Hendrix, and give them their own format. And the idea was to be as commercial as possible without losing progressive identity, to be extremely accessible, but at the same time very progressive and very much attached to this new thing that was going on. And the way we did it, basically, was by changing the familiarity factor from song title to artist. Whereas in 1968, on a big top 40 station, you knew every song. What we want to do is have that same kind of familiarity, but with an AOR station, to have artist familiarity, where whenever you tuned in, you knew every artist. But somebody would hear a group like the Moody Blues, and they'd go, well, God, that's the Moody Blues, but I haven't heard that song before. And the result was a feeling of musical depth without sacrificing familiarity. And we also wanted to balance science with emotion, to where everything started emotionally, but was tested or backed up with some kind of scientific evidence. Because back then you had stations that were over-tested, and as a result were kind of boring. Then you had the all-emotional stations, which were right about 10% of the time and wrong the other 90%. So anyway, to make a long story short, 1968, 1969, all these bands were happening, needed their own format. Underground radio was too underground, and Top 40 radio was really focusing on just hits regardless of the sound, and this whole thing was happening, so we developed this format. Now, in the early 70s, everything was pretty easy. We had a thing called the Superstars format, and along with guys like ABC-FM and a couple other groups, you could waltz into pretty much any market and clean up, because what you'd go into is a situation where there was an underground station with a jock named Aquarius playing rain songs, or you'd have the choice of a big top 40 station that would, be ripping people off with little prizes and trinkets all day long and playing Donny Osmond records. And we were just playing all the hits by Led Zeppelin, Pink Floyd, Jethro Tull, Crosby, Stills and Nash, one after another. And it was really a waltz, because we were able to just clean up instantly. No genius, no secrets, just playing the hits of this new musical movement. Then about 1978, things got a little crazy. First of all, a lot of the first generation of these new bands started going Vegas. Bands like Blood, Sweat and Tears in Chicago were starting to play Caesar's Palace in Vegas and in Reno. Another thing that happened is a lot of these first-generation bands like Emerson, Lake and Palmer stopped making good records. I think it might have just been an artistic burnout, but by 1978, yes, Jethro Tull, Emerson, Lake and Palmer really had hit a musical plateau, and things weren't really happening for them anymore. And if you were there listening to the music back in 78, you'll remember songs and albums by groups like ELP, Love Beach, which sold about 200,000 records after selling millions in their previous releases. Another thing that happened is the new thing from England, which was always the savior of rock and roll radio, was something kind of weird. Because now in 1964 it was the Beatles, in 1968 it was Jethro Tull, in 74 it was Peter Frampton, but by 1978 the new thing from England was Kill Your Parents, by the Toilet Bowls, which was punk rock. So, that was kind of weird. The new thing from England really wasn't relevant. Then disco happened. Saturday Night Fever was the #1 album, and we AOR stations wanted to know, are we supposed to play this? And we later found out you blow up disco records between games at a doubleheader and do it for the cause of rock and roll, as we did in the Loop in Chicago back then. But the real important thing that happened in 1978 that was the most confusing thing to AOR radio was the Great 25 to 34 scare. There was census data leaking out that got well publicized, indicating there will be no teenagers left on Earth by the year 1981. So a lot of owners, managers, and programmers of AOR stations back in the late 70s started going a little bit crazy, figuring that their 12 to 24 dominance was going to be no longer relevant because there won't be any 12 to 24s left. So there was a major decision that had to be made by AOR stations, and that was to maintain 12 to 24 dominance or to grow up with the audience in a natural way. And the decision was made not by one individual but by the AOR community in general to go after the natural audience of AOR. And the natural audience in 1970 was teens, in the late 70s was 18 to 24, and now moving up to 1988, AOR's natural audience is 25 plus. AOR is in the wonderful position of being the new WGN-type middle-of-the-road giant. And AOR's big problem in the year 2010 is going to be the audience is dying off. So what's happened to AOR is a whole generation of people that grew up with the audience. They were teenagers in the early 70s, and now the average AOR listener is really late 20s, early mid-30s, and there are a lot of 40-year-old AOR listeners that think it's the greatest format ever. Now, here in 1988, that leaves a whole generation of people that need their radio station that's playing their groups. Because what's happening right now is a completely new generation of Jethro Tulls and Crosby, Stills and Nashes, groups like Guns N' Roses, Cinderella, Bon Jovi, who are selling millions of records, packing concert halls everywhere across North America and around the world. And quite frankly, the fans of this kind of music, they look at AOR as their parents' music. It's it's just not relevant to them. Crosby, Stills and Nash are a bunch of old people. They want their bands, and that's where Z-Rock comes in. We are nothing more than doing to radio what AOR did to radio in the late 60s and early and mid-70s, giving a whole generation of people, a whole new generation of bands, their own format. And, of course, the same questions arise. Is it just a bunch of hippies? Is it a fad? And we heard the same thing in 1970, that this AOR thing is never going to last, Led Zeppelin's going to go away, and it just doesn't work that way. And, of course, a lot of people look at this new generation of music as being dangerous, and it's just as dangerous as Elvis Presley, the Beatles, or Santana, or Jimi Hendrix was. It's a new movement you can't deny, and it needs its own station. Now, what we're doing at Z-Rock is a lot different as far as presentation from what AOR was all about. What we're really doing is combining the character of 60s Top 40, which was a 24-hour morning show, because I think most radio stations have a lot of fun until 10 o'clock in the morning, and then at 10:01 you got to be boring because it's not morning drive anymore. We scream, we burn 24 hours a day. Because back in the late 60s when AOR came on, people were mellow and laid back, and as a result, AOR was very mellow and laid back. People aren't mellow today. So on Z-Rock, we're presenting the character, the intensity, the sort of controlled insanity of the great 60s Top 40 stations, balancing that with the cutting-edge nature that AOR had in the early 70s. We're presenting these platinum bands. I mean, these bands are slam dunks. There's no mystery to this, just like in 1971 there was no mystery about Led Zeppelin. So we want that cutting edge, very current, very little, if any, classic rock. We may throw in a few anthems now and then, but not to the point where we'll overlap in any way with AOR. And the third factor is the national muscle of an MTV. A lot of people look at a Z-Rock as being an automation alternative, something to do, a last-ditch effort. This format is geared to get some major league numbers. We're going to use our muscle. We are the CNN, the MTV, or the USA Today of radio. National and very proud of it. It's sort of like we're McDonald's, and if someone wants to go into a market and try it locally against a McDonald's, our attitude is go ahead. We've got the best, hottest jocks. We've got some national promotions that are lined up that'll just knock your socks off. So it's really a combination of the character of Top 40, the cutting edge of early AOR, and that national marketing muscle that we're going to take full advantage of. We're also introducing a whole new generation of special features. Right now AOR and other contemporary formats are two-fering their listeners to death. It's always a two-for Tuesday, or an album hour at midnight, or a block party. And these ideas are coming on 20 years old. So what we're doing is generating a whole new generation of special programming features, image enhancers, things that get people talking again. We're doing things as crazy as nuking Madonna records in the middle of afternoon drive. We're playing records backwards, having listeners guess what they are. And again, on paper, it's the kind of thing where you're doing what? But believe me, it's a kind of carny that makes great radio stations great. And if you're playing hits, too, I mean, look out. Now, another thing is, will this work on AM? I think it'll work on any great signal. From the focus groups we've done where we tested this whole format just to see, is it me or will anybody else listen to this? The typical reaction was, hey, man, I'd listen to this on the police band. I mean, these people are so starved for a rebellious, state-of-the-art radio station that plays their music. We're the Mad Magazine of radio, and we're party and not doom. We're not a heavy metal satanic station like some people would like to think. We're just a straight-ahead 1988 rock and roll station. Look at Billboard. We're playing number 1, we're playing number 2, we're playing number 3, and nobody else is playing those artists in its purity. Those are the Guns N' Roses, the Cinderellas, and Bon Jovis. Another thing is theater of the mind. We're bringing back amazing production to the overall feel of a radio station. Right now, I think most radio stations are black and white. We're definitely Technicolor. And we definitely have swagger. We know we're good, and we're just going to get better, and we're taking advantage of it. And we're not elitist, though. That's another thing we learned from the early AOR days, where there was a tendency for programmers to think, oh, we know about music and our job is to educate the people. That is not our attitude at all. We've learned all about that. And it gets back to the point I made earlier, balancing science with emotion. We may feel emotional about the music, but we balance it with science to make sure we're right. I think the idea here for a potential Z-Rock affiliate is to understand that this is the opportunity to own the franchise. You look at a WMMR in Philadelphia today, which is always number 1 or number 2. They didn't just decide to be number 1 or number 2 a few years ago. They grabbed the Philadelphia rock and roll, AOR, whatever you want to call it, franchise in the early 70s and built it, and here they are. And the opportunity is the same right now, because this hard rock thing that we're dealing with is not going to go away. A lot of people look at it as hard rock, where in reality it's a whole new generation of music. It's not a sound, it's a movement. And I think the opportunity to own the franchise is here right now, because today's Hendrixes and Creams are Guns N' Roses and Bon Jovis. Now, from my standpoint, this is the best gig in the world. I worked with, I guess over 200 AOR stations, bouncing around Cleveland on Monday, Columbus on Tuesday. My function now as managing director is to totally focus on Z-Rock and make it completely happen. Because I dealt with a company, we had a great format called Superstars. It worked, it still works. But the problem was you could never focus. With Z-Rock, this is a focus. I'm sort of the in-house consultant, as I mentioned earlier, again, with the best air staff, hand-picked, that I've seen in 20 years. Part of the magic is in what you don't hear. Keep that in mind. Just like in 1971, the magic of AOR was you didn't hear Gary Puckett and his Union Gap records between Moody Blues and Hendrix. And now you don't hear Moody Blues oldies or Madonna hits in between Cinderella and Bon Jovi records. As far as the target goes, we are number 1 teen-oriented, number 1 18 to 24 men and women, and top 3 in 25 to 34s, primarily men. The way we'll establish this is by reaching 2 types of listeners. One is the reliable listener, who is buying millions and millions and millions of these records and is going to think this is the greatest thing ever and listen to it all the time. Then there's a mood listener, who all we want with the mood listeners to be one of their buttons on their dial. So they might listen to classic rock during the day, news radio in the morning, but when they're in the mood to rock, they'll know exactly where to go, punch us in, and it'll just add to our queue. We're not a mystery format. The main thing I have to stress is that it is new, just like the Beatles or Elvis or Santana used to be new. But there's a new thing happening out there, and we're targeting for that. We're a flag carrier for the new mainstream. We're America's most dangerous radio station, no question about it. Again, the 24-hour morning show, a completely over-the-top, intense presentation, but dangerous all the way to the bank. We're loud, we're proud, we're definitely fast. The station completely moves. And our idea really is to be an MTV on radio, not by sounding like MTV, but to have that same national profile. And again, for me, this is the greatest gig in the world, because when AOR came along, I was fortunately, with good timing, right there to develop the format. And how often do you see another opportunity to supersede AOR, which is what I see right now? So anyhow, I'd love to talk to you about this in more detail, because if you can imagine, theater of the mind, I have tons of yellow pads in front of me about concepts and ideas on why this is working now and why it's going to continue to work, and I'd love to share those with you, so please call me. Thank you.